Hey guys, Fazzy back here, and in today's video we're going to be going over some general roster editing tips. So what do I mean by that? This isn't going to be covering how do you do ratings, how do you do potentials, X factors, etc. All of those are extremely subjective, and let's be honest, no one is ever going to 100% agree on ratings. So I have a list of 8 or 9-ish different little tips and tricks, general good practices to follow when setting up your roster, however you may choose to do so. So there's going to be stuff with created players, there's going to be stuff with in-game players, and you'll see what I mean here as we get into today's video. So with that being said, let's jump into it and let's take a look at our first tip here in game, and that is regarding created players. So let's go over to the creation zone. This first tip is a very small one, but it is something that does actually matter in a game. So let's go find a player from the, let's just say 2024 NHL draft class. There's one that I'm thinking of that, worked perfect with this, but this applies to literally any player you create. If you can do this, make sure you do. And that player is a Dean LTIR. And again, I'm just kind of choosing him here out of random, but he does, totally apply to what I'm going to be saying here today. And this was actually a tip that Tugi taught to me a couple of years ago. It's something I never even thought of in the past, but it makes a lot of sense. So we have Dean LTIR here created. Everything is good to go. And the first tip is regarding the draft year. So you may say, oh, he's a 2024 draft pick. Just have him set as that. I see a lot of people having them as undrafted. Do not do that. You want to have the latest draft year possible. You may think, what does it matter? But it actually does when it comes to signing rights of a player. It gives the AI team an extra year to sign those players, which is never a bad thing. In this scenario, obviously, we have an artificial ELC to let her know, so it doesn't matter as much. But for, those lower players that you can't give artificial ELCs to just because of the amount of those players, definitely go and give them the latest draft year possible, and hopefully it can reduce some of the player cuts in franchise mode. So moving on, my second tip here when it comes to, especially when it comes to created players, I'm going to actually go to the player movement screen here. Probably a better example is one I actually don't really follow myself as much, which I should. I'm just very, very stubborn. And that is when it comes to assigning players. You want to make sure that you're signing them to one of the CHL leagues. Doesn't matter what, OHL, QMJHL, WHL. You just want to make sure that any younger guys are assigned to these teams. That is because players like Danny Nelson, who I believe we had to give a artificial ELC to, if he's in the CHL, that contract becomes exempt. Where sometimes we've been putting them, I just go and throw them all in the Ice League for the most part, just because it's kind of out of the way. If they're in the CHL and stuff like that, people will be like, why are these rosters so bloated? That's kind of why I'm so stubborn about it. But if you throw them in the CHL teams and you give them those artificial contracts, they'll be exempt. They won't count against that 50-player limit in franchise mode, which again plays into player cuts and, seeing prospects on the free agent list when you shouldn't. So that is my second tip here for today. Take advantage of the CHL and make sure you use it when assigning younger players. Moving on here to our next tip actually comes in regards to player potentials for NHL players already in game. I know I said at the start of the video, I'm not talking about how you should do potentials. I'm just giving you some facts here about how they work in game. So I think we all know that players under 27 still have that chance to grow in franchise mode, and that potential really does matter. But it still really does matter for players that are above that age as well. It does affect how long and how successful their career will be in the future. So a guy like Troy Terry, even though he's 28, if you give him a super low potential, like what we did with Kopitar this year, he is going to end up starting to drop off a lot quicker in franchise mode. We use this for Kopitar to try and get him to retire as soon as possible. Still plays really good in game, he'll still put up 50 to 60 points for you. But if you have him at like a medium franchise, he's going to be playing forever. So these potentials on older players, you may think they don't matter and they're just for show, but they actually do affect how the game works in the back end. And I think that contributes to, everyone can relate to seeing all these old guys sticking around in franchise mode for years and years after they would have retired. I think a lot of that comes down to whatever potential they get at the start. And maybe that's something we should look at nerfing, just to try and get those guys to retire a little bit closer to what they likely would be in real life. Moving on here to our next tip, and it actually involves salary cap compliance. So this is obviously always an issue, especially if you're even using the EA rosters. Like half the time they're not compliant whatsoever because they can't take into account all the LTIR ramifications. But I think we all know, it's easy enough to fix a player in the first year franchise mode when your team's over. Take a 1-year contract and just reduce it down. Simple enough. But how do you do that when you have future extensions in game that will end up getting those contracts in later years cut down? It's a little bit more challenging, but honestly, it is very doable. So let's say there was a player with an extension here on Florida, putting them way over for season 2. What you want to do is find a player that has a 2-year contract left in the current day. So Evan Rodriguez, Lou Osterainen here, both of these players would work perfectly. You can do it to as many players as you want, just as long as you get it to end up working more or less. Go into the contracts here, reduce his 2-year deal down to a 1-year deal, and then go and add another 1-year extension to that player on a league minimum contract. Is it ideal? No, but I would much rather have one of these players on a reduced bargain contract than giving a superstar that has a huge contract extension in game, a break on that deal. So I think it makes it a little bit more realistic and is something that I would make sure you go through and check prior to starting up your franchise mode save. So the next tip really is honestly more of an observation of anything, and it regards around older players that are still playing in Europe. So I think we know that there's still players that have good ratings in Europe. You have Lindblom, you have Haig, Janssen Fjallby, Nick Backstrom. Like, these players aren't super highly rated, but they can still play, at the AHL level in some regard. The thing is, what I found, normally when you load into franchise mode, they just dump all these players from Europe into free agency. That doesn't happen if the player is 75 overall or better. So, Lindblom here, if you started up a franchise mode, he's not going to be in it right away, unless you go and drop him to free agency just to begin with. But if you go and lower him to, let's just say, like 74 overall, he is going to appear in the free agent list, and there's nothing else you have to do. So again, is it the biggest thing? No, but definitely gives you the option to choose how you want to deal with these players. You might not want to see these players in franchise mode whatsoever. Feel free to leave them 100%. But if you want to see some of these names in game, you're going to either have to lower the overall or just go and dump them to the free agent list manually yourself prior to starting. And then of course they will be there in game. And again, it totally depends on how you want to run things. I know there's some players that you may want to still have in franchise mode, especially in the National League of all leagues. There's some pretty good rated players. Thomas Tatar, Dominik Kubalik, Jan Ruda, Jimmy Vesey, Puljujärvi. Like, there's some actual good names here that if you start right now, none of these players will be in franchise mode. Philip Zadina. But if you want to get them in free agency, like I said, do the following steps that I mentioned and everything should be good to go. Moving on to our next tip, and it's a pretty obvious one. It's one that a lot of people, I think, just kind of do generally if you're editing rosters, but that's getting rid of the LTI players in game. So obviously these players are still technically on NHL rosters, just due to the salary cap. Obviously San Jose is a team very much taking advantage of that this year. And you may say, what's the harm in just leaving them? They're never going to really play for you anyway. But the issue is these guys still take up roster spots. Whereas in the NHL, they can go on like LTIR. The rules definitely aren't as strict for these guys, I wouldn't assume. But when you're having to hand out artificial entry-level contracts to players, again, they're not always exempt. For the most part, you can get them to that state, but it doesn't work 100% of the time. So any extra room you have when it comes to contract space, definitely get rid of these players when possible. I would not use them as cap whales. Go and use someone that's on a 1-year deal that's an UFA, as low as rated as possible. Get someone from the AHL. If you really want to have cap whales to make things work salary cap compliance wise, definitely go that way. Do not use these players whatsoever. Best place is always just throwing them on international teams. That is what we have done here for the past number of seasons. The next tip is a rather important one and is one that I don't see a lot of people taking full advantage of. And that is getting players in that year 4 entry draft that are created by you. So we have Max Milarchuk here. I absolutely probably butchered that name. Supposed to be going number 1 overall in the year 4 NHL entry draft, whatever that is, 28, 29. You may say, how do you actually add players in for that draft? Because if you do it the way you normally would with other players in year 1, year 2's NHL entry draft, again, it's very standard how that process works. But when it comes to younger players, you keep getting that issue where it says younger players cannot be assigned to these teams, even for whatever reason, if it's the CHL. It doesn't like having the 14-year-olds there for whatever reason. I don't know why. If any league should have them, it probably should be them. But regardless, that is an issue that you're going to see happen every single time when creating these players. If the game doesn't tell you it is still possible, you just have to do an extra step to get it to work. So let's go create a player here. We have our superstar. It all comes down to the draft year, month, and not really date, just really the year and the month. So leave this on a older age. 1999 is perfectly fine. For the month, you either want to have a November birth date or a December birth date. Like I said, the day does not matter whatsoever. Keep one of those two. You can go in here. You can make them a franchise player, whatever you want to do. Just be mindful when you're editing attributes for players this young. They have 4 years to develop, so overalls can kind of get out of control there with that extra amount of time. So just something to be mindful of. So now we have our player created. He's 25 years old. You may say, how does that work? How is he not 14? Let's go and assign him to a team. Let's go to the SHL. Doesn't matter where you throw him, just assign him to a team. Let's go in there to play with Anton Frondel. Now we can go in and re-edit him and fix that age. So now that we have him created, we have him assigned to a team. The game can't remove him without us doing that ourselves. So now going down here to the age, now we can go and make that a 2010 birthday. And since it's set in December, we kind of spoof that age of the draft year cutoff, allowing players to get into that year 4 NHL entry draft. Now, if we go back to our player, 14 years old, medium franchise grinder, ready to go, ready to load into franchise. This is going to have to sometimes be done for players in the year 3 draft, depending when their birthdays are, but it's a good way of getting real life players. Again, we don't know how good they're going to be, still a little bit out, in those future draft classes. Better than AI, EA generated players anyway. Next tip is in regards to created teams. It is a smaller one, but it is an important one if you're planning to play with any of these teams. So we go through and we add in a bunch of created teams, and there's a lot of vintage NHL ones where you have a different look. Let's just say you want to go and use the Buffalo Sabres and substitute them into our franchise mode. You can do that. The important thing, very, very important, is making sure those rosters that this team is assigned, this Buffalo Sabres created team, matches whatever the NHL roster is for the real Buffalo Sabres in game. If not, that's where you're going to see duplicated players. I know there is one Tactics franchise, he used one of our roster builds, and they weren't exactly the same. I think it was one of the Utah ones, and you saw like multiple Dylan Gunthers, stuff like that. Because one was in the AHL, one was assigned to an NHL roster, and it doesn't take into account the AHL players. So that's where you're going to see those duplicated players. This is always the very last step we do here before putting out a roster, going through and just literally going to the Sabres, adding every player on that NHL roster to the created team version, and then everything should be go. You should not run into any unforeseen issues when starting franchise mode. Then lastly, I wanted to go through the roster merge process. Again, not really as much of a tip, but there's so much confusion around this process that I wanted to throw it in here at least. So, the roster merge allows you to take anything you've done in your created rosters and merge them with the most recent EA ones. I do want to point out it can only be done when it says custom roster 1, 2, etc. It can't be done with an official roster. Again, it's easy enough to literally just go and create a new active file from someone else's creation, so that's not an issue. But you just have to make sure you're selecting one that says custom roster 1 or custom roster 2, because it'll take that and it'll make a custom roster 3. Basically, when you merge rosters with EA, anything that you have done for ratings for any player that is already in game, NHL, AHL, CHL, Europe, that all gets reverted to whatever the most recent EA update shows. This can be good and this can be bad. You obviously will have to redo everything, but you will get access to some of those players that may get added in later on. When it comes to the created players after doing a roster merge, everyone has to be reassigned. Unless you're on a created team roster, that's why you're seeing some players still have a team. But outside of that, if you just start up a franchise mode right now, you're getting every single created player here dumped to free agency. Whether it be alumni, whether it be future prospects, everyone just goes straight there. So I only recommend doing it if you have a smaller build, probably somewhere in the range of like 100 prospects, won't take too long to, reassign. I'd maybe do it then. Created teams will all stay as well. Honestly though, at this point, I think we're kind of at the point where we don't need the roster merge anymore. It was always so important for moving around draft picks, but now we have the freedom to do so. So the only thing you're gonna really see is, a few extra players that you can go in and create yourself, and as well as new head coach updates whenever those do happen in the real world. That's the only thing you're gonna really see from the roster merge. So probably not really worth your time. Depends, totally up to you though. Just kind of wanted to explain that process, as I do see quite a few questions regarding how to merge and should I do it and should I not. So I think that's going to do it for today's video. Again, I just wanted to share some small tips and tricks regards to everything around the process of roster editing. Like I said, I don't really want to give you 100%. It has to be done this way when it comes to those subjective overalls, potentials. Again, we're never going to see every single player exactly the same, and that's totally all right. But I want to give you kind of some of these smaller tips and tricks of how the game actually works itself for you to be able to put out the best version of your rosters. So yeah, that is going to do it for today's video. Definitely let me know, what do you think of this kind of video in the comments down below. If you guys like it, maybe I can come up with a part 2 of some tips and tricks. I don't know. Have to do some digging and see what I can find. But that is going to do it for today's video. I'll see you all in the next one.